A knight in shining armor was actually a walking piece of high technology. The evolution of medieval armor is a story written not by kings, but by blacksmiths and metalworkers in smoky forges. By the end of this journey, you will understand the secret science that turned brittle iron into the resilient steel of a full-plate harness. We will uncover how a mysterious steel from the East influenced European workshops, and why the perfect quench in water or oil meant the difference between life and death. What forgotten innovation do you think had the biggest impact on the knight's final form? That iconic suit of plate armor was a distant dream for the early medieval knight. His world was one of iron, a material as frustrating as it was fundamental. The metal that came from the bloomery furnace was not the pure, homogeneous substance we think of today. Instead, it was a spongy, slag-riddled mass called a bloom, a lump of iron intertwined with glassy impurities. A blacksmith's first monumental task was to heat and hammer this bloom for days on end, literally beating the slag out of it to create a workable billet of metal. The result was a material that was inconsistent, often brittle, and notoriously difficult to shape into anything large or complex. This is why the classic early knight wore a simple conical helmet and a long coat of chainmail, a hauberk. Creating a mail hauberk was a testament to patience, requiring the painstaking linking of thousands of hand-forged iron rings. This armor was a marvel of craftsmanship against slashing swords, its flexible mesh dispersing the energy of a cut. But its weakness was terrifyingly simple. The crushing blow from a mace or the focused point of a warhammer's beak transferred its force directly through the rings and into the body beneath, breaking bones and causing catastrophic internal injury without even piercing the metal. This fundamental vulnerability, this stark choice between mobility and true safety, is what set medieval Europe on a centuries-long quest. The answer would not come from a change in design, but from a revolution in the very substance of the metal itself. Faced with such brittle iron, blacksmiths had to become alchemists of the anvil. Their first great forgotten breakthrough was not the discovery of a new metal, but a masterful deception of nature itself. It was called pattern welding. Imagine taking several thin rods, some of soft iron and others of hard, high-carbon steel, and heating them until they glow. The smith would then twist these rods together into a tight spiral like a metal rope and hammer them while white-hot, fusing them into a single, solid billet. This was not a uniform piece of steel. It was a sophisticated laminate, a composite material engineered for survival. The resulting blade or armor component possessed a genius combination of properties. The hard steel resisted deformation and held a lethal edge, while the softer iron fibers woven throughout absorbed impacts and prevented the entire piece from shattering like glass. For a sword, this meant a blade that was both sharp and resilient. For armor, though less common, it meant a helmet or a guard that could withstand a brutal blow without failing catastrophically. The swirling, watery patterns etched into the surface of these objects were far more than mere decoration. They were a direct map of the complex, interwoven structure within, a visual promise of the smith's skill and the material's hidden strength. This artful technique represented a monumental leap in thinking. It was the dawn of understanding that by combining different types of metal, you could create a new substance that was greater than the sum of its parts. Pattern welding paved the way for everything that would follow, proving that the future of armor lay not in finding a perfect metal, but in learning how to build one. Pattern welding was a brilliant stopgap, a clever way to make flawed iron behave like something more. But the battlefield is a brutally honest testing ground, and new weapons were emerging that laughed at such cleverness. The English longbow, a simple-looking stave of yew wood, could launch a heavy arrow with enough force to punch straight through chainmail at a frightening distance. On the open field, a knight facing a volley of these arrows was not just in a fight, he was in a storm of steel-tipped hail. Even more terrifying was the fully armored cavalry charge, where a knight couched his lance under his arm, turning his entire horse and body into a single, unstoppable spear point. The impact of such a charge did not just cut, it shattered. It delivered a concussive force that could cave in a chest plate, crush ribs, and cause fatal internal bleeding without leaving a single scratch on the mail shirt beneath. Armorers now faced a terrifying new reality. They were not just crafting protection against swords and axes anymore. They were engineering a defense against focused, armor-rending ballistics and colossal, bone-jarring concussions. This escalating arms race created an immense financial incentive. For a king or a wealthy lord, outfitting his knights was a massive investment. A knight killed because his armor failed was not just a personal tragedy. It was the destruction of a hugely expensive military asset. The pressure was immense to fund any innovation, any new technique that could produce a harder, tougher, more resilient plate of steel. This desperate need for superior metal would soon lead to one of the most transformative inventions in the entire history of metallurgy, a new type of furnace that would fundamentally change the material of war. The solution to this escalating arms race arrived not with a whisper, but with a roaring blast of air. Tucked away in the Pyrenees Mountains, a new kind of furnace was changing the very nature of iron. It was called the Catalan Forge, and its secret was force. Earlier bloomeries were passive, relying on the whim of the wind to feed their fires. The Catalan Forge was aggressive. It used massive, water-wheel-driven bellows to pump a continuous, powerful stream of air directly into the heart of the furnace. This was the difference between a gentle breeze and a focused hurricane. The result was a fire so intensely hot it achieved what had once been impossible. It did not just soften the iron ore, it completely liquefied it. For the first time, metal flowed like water. This liquid iron, known as pig iron, would pour out of the furnace into waiting channels of sand, looking less like a blacksmith's bloom and more like a silvery, molten river. This was a paradigm shift in production. Suddenly, you were not just hammering a stubborn lump of slag-ridden metal. You were casting liquid into basic shapes, creating uniform ingots of raw material on an entirely new scale. But raw pig iron was brittle, too high in carbon to be useful for armor on its own. The true genius of this system was what came next. These cast ingots could then be reheated in a separate finery hearth, where a smith would carefully manage the fire to burn off the excess carbon, transforming that brittle pig iron into a tough, reliable, and consistent grade of steel. This two-step process was the real revolution. It meant that for the first time, a master armorer could order large sheets of steel, knowing their quality and properties would be predictable. He did not have to waste weeks hammering the imperfections out of a dozen different blooms, each with its own hidden weaknesses. The Catalan Forge moved metalworking from a bespoke craft, where every piece was a unique struggle, into a form of early industry. It provided the foundational material, the very canvas upon which the art of the plate armorer could finally be painted. Without this steady, reliable supply of good steel, the iconic suit of armor would have remained a fantastically expensive rarity for kings, not the battlefield standard it became. But a sheet of steel is not a suit of armor. The Catalan Forge provided the raw material, but the real challenge was in the shaping. How do you take a flat, unyielding plate and form it into the elegant, body-hugging curves of a breastplate or the complex dome of a helmet? The answer arrived with the rhythmic, earth-shaking thunder of the water-powered hammer mill. This was the trip hammer, a machine that fundamentally changed the physical limits of the forge. Powered by a water wheel, these mechanical giants lifted massive hammers, some weighing hundreds of pounds, and let them drop with relentless, consistent force. Imagine the difference between a craftsman patiently tapping a shape with his hand hammer and the raw, industrial power of a piston-driven fist of iron slamming down again and again. This was not a replacement for the smith's skill, but a monumental extension of his strength. It was the difference between carving a statue with a chisel and having a giant pre-shape the marble block for you. These hammers could draw out a billet of steel into a wide, uniform plate in a fraction of the time it took by hand. They could begin the heavy work of dishing a helmet skull or curving a greave, the plate that protected the shin. This mechanization was a quiet revolution happening inside the workshop walls. It drastically reduced the sheer physical labor and time required to produce a single armor component. But its most crucial role was in making the new, tougher steels workable. The superior steel from the new furnaces was harder and more resilient, but it was also more stubborn, more resistant to the blows of a lone smith. The trip hammer was the only tool with the sheer, brute force needed to persuade that advanced metal into submission. It was this powerful partnership, the reliable steel and the machine that could shape it, that finally unlocked the possibility of the full plate harness. So how did an armorer take that newly available sheet of steel and give it the perfect balance of hardness and flexibility? The answer lies in a secret chemical recipe, a form of kitchen magic performed at the forge. This fundamental process was called carburization, though the smiths who practiced it knew it as case hardening. Imagine taking a finished piece of iron, something like a helmet skull or a gauntlet, and burying it inside a sealed clay box packed full of charcoal or even crushed animal bone. This container would then be heated in the forge for hours, sometimes for an entire day or more. The intense, prolonged heat did more than just make the metal glow. It triggered a slow, invisible migration. Atoms of carbon from the surrounding charcoal would gradually seep into the surface of the iron, penetrating just a few millimeters deep. This transformed the outer skin of the object into a hard, high-carbon steel, creating a resilient case around the piece. But the interior remained the original, softer, more malleable iron. This was the genius of the technique. You were not creating a uniform piece of steel. You were engineering a composite material, a single object with two distinct personalities. The hard, steel case was incredibly resistant to wear, capable of deflecting sword blows and stopping the points of arrows. Yet, if a mace strike landed with overwhelming force, the softer, flexible iron core beneath would give way just enough to absorb the shock and prevent the entire piece from cracking or shattering like a dinner plate. This was the best of both worlds, a perfect marriage of a hard shell and a tough, forgiving heart. Think of a modern car's safety features, designed to crumple in a specific way to protect the passengers inside. The medieval armorer was achieving a similar goal with fire, charcoal, and an intuitive grasp of surface chemistry. This secret science was absolutely crucial for the most vulnerable components, the helmet protecting the skull and the gauntlets shielding the hands. Without this hidden layer of steel skin, the evolution of armor would have hit a literal wall, unable to progress beyond the limitations of simple iron. Yet, even with its hardened case, the steel was not yet ready for battle. The most dangerous and dramatic moment in an armor's creation was still to come, the terrifying plunge known as the quench. After the carburized piece was heated to a brilliant, glowing orange, the armorer would lift it from the forge with long tongs. For a single, breathless second, the superheated steel hung in the air, its internal structure transformed by the intense heat into a state called austenite, a form that could accept a radical change. Then came the plunge, a violent hiss and cloud of steam as the glowing metal was submerged into a waiting trough of liquid. This was not a simple cooling. It was a shock, a thermal arrest so rapid it froze the steel's internal lattice into an incredibly hard, needle-like structure known as martensite. In an instant, the metal became far more resistant to any edge or point that might try to pierce it. But this newfound hardness came at a terrible cost. Martensite is notoriously brittle. An armor plate quenched to this state could stop a lance, but the very next blow from a mace might cause it to shatter into pieces, sending lethal shards of steel into the wearer's face. This is where the armorer's secret knowledge became priceless. The choice of quenching medium was a life or death decision. Water provided the fastest, most severe quench, creating the hardest possible steel, but it was a gamble that often led to catastrophic cracks snaking across the surface. Oil, heated to a specific temperature, offered a slower, more forgiving quench. It produced a slightly less hard but far tougher result, drastically reducing the risk of failure. Some workshops even used brine, a saltwater solution that created a vapor jacket around the metal for a more even cooling. Getting this single step wrong could undo weeks of painstaking work, transforming a masterpiece into worthless, fractured scrap in the time it took to draw a single breath. The perfect quench gave the armor its essential hardness, but it also created a deadly fragility. This left the armorer with one final, crucial puzzle to solve: how to tame the brittle monster he had just created. That final, shocking plunge into the quenching bath left the steel in a state of dangerous perfection. It was now incredibly hard, but also as brittle as fine glassware. A suit of armor in this condition would be a death trap, its plates liable to shatter from a heavy mace strike and send sharp fragments into the very person it was meant to protect. The armorer's final, masterful act was to tame this brittle monster through a process known as tempering. This was not about adding more hardness, it was about engineering resilience. Tempering was a delicate dance with heat, a carefully controlled reheating of the quenched steel to a much lower temperature. The armorer would gently warm the hardened piece over a fire, watching it with an eagle's focus. He was performing a subtle trade, sacrificing a tiny fraction of that extreme hardness for a massive gain in toughness and flexibility. The goal was to create a metal that could not only stop a weapon but also bend just a little without breaking. The precision of this process was everything. A lower tempering temperature would leave the armor harder and more rigid, ideal for deflecting sword points. A higher temperature would make it tougher and more shock-absorbent, perfect for facing crushing blows. But how could these smiths, centuries before the invention of the thermometer, possibly measure such a specific and critical temperature? Their tool was the steel itself, and their gauge was a spectrum of color. As the metal warmed, a thin oxide layer would form on its surface, shimmering through a beautiful and highly informative sequence of hues. A pale, straw yellow indicated a lower temperature, preserving more hardness. As the heat increased, the color would shift to a deep bronze, then to a magnificent purple, and finally to a brilliant sky blue. Each color was a direct, visible signal of the steel's internal state. Blue meant the highest tempering temperature, producing the toughest, most forgiving steel. This was color-based metallurgy, a sophisticated science passed down from master to apprentice. It was this final, careful step that transformed a hardened but fragile shell into a trusted, life-saving defense. The knight's armor was now a masterpiece of balanced properties, a shield that was both hard and tough. Yet, even with this perfected metal, another challenge remained. How do you assemble these individual plates of tempered steel into a single, mobile suit that allows a warrior to actually move and fight? the tempered steel plate was now a marvel of balanced strength and resilience. But how do you take these perfected pieces and build a complete suit of armor that allows a warrior to actually move? This puzzle led to a fascinating and often overlooked experiment in design, a suit of armor that was not a single shell, but a kind of wearable architecture. Before the iconic full-plate harness became dominant, armorers were already thinking in layers. They developed a system known as laminar armor. Imagine not a solid breastplate, but a curtain of overlapping horizontal steel strips, each one a narrow, manageable plate. These individual lames were laced together vertically with strong leather cords, creating a protective surface for the torso or limbs that was both rigid and surprisingly flexible. When you moved, the strips could slide slightly over one another, allowing the entire assembly to bend and twist with the body. This was not a metallurgical breakthrough in the forge, but a brilliant philosophical one in the workshop. It was a clever workaround to one of the biggest technical challenges of the era, producing a single, massive, perfectly curved plate of high-quality steel. Creating a large breastplate required a huge, flawless sheet of metal and immense skill to shape it without creating weak points, but a small, narrow strip. That was far easier to carburize, to quench, and to temper uniformly. The armorer could focus on perfecting dozens of these smaller, more reliable components, knowing that the failure of one lame would not compromise the entire defense. He was essentially building a larger, more flexible wall out of many perfect miniature bricks. This pragmatic approach maximized the potential of the materials available, creating formidable protection from components that were, on their own, much simpler to produce. It was a testament to the ingenuity of armorers who were master problem solvers, finding elegant solutions not just in the chemistry of the metal, but in the very geometry of its assembly. This layered approach demonstrated a profound understanding that the best defense was often a system of well-made parts working in harmony. This layered approach with lames was a brilliant stopgap, but the ultimate solution was already being worn under the knight's surcoat. The true predecessor to the iconic breastplate was the coat of plates, a garment of hidden genius. Outwardly, it looked like a simple cloth or leather tunic, but inside, its secret was riveted to the fabric. Dozens of overlapping steel plates, each one small and manageable for an armorer to harden and temper perfectly, were fastened to the inside of the foundation garment. When a knight donned this coat, he was not just putting on armor, he was becoming a walking lesson in distributed force. The true brilliance of this design was not just in hiding the plates, but in how they worked together under pressure. Imagine the point of a cavalry lance slamming into the chest. On a solid breastplate, that entire, bone-shattering force would be concentrated on a single spot. But on the coat of plates, the impact was not stopped by one plate. It was transferred, shared, and dissipated across the entire overlapping array of steel scales beneath the cloth. The energy of the blow spread out horizontally, traveling across multiple plates and into the sturdy foundation garment, which itself helped to absorb and redistribute the force across the wearer's torso. This was a fundamental shift in thinking, moving from the idea of a single, impenetrable wall to a sophisticated system that managed and redirected energy. It was the difference between trying to stop a charging bull with a rigid post and stopping it with a wide, strong net. This principle of load distribution became the golden rule for all future plate armor. It also solved a major production problem. Creating a single, massive, curved breastplate from the best steel was a monumental and risky task, but creating dozens of small, flat plates was far more reliable. Each one could be individually carburized, quenched, and tempered to perfection, minimizing the chance of a catastrophic flaw that would ruin an entire suit. The coat of plates was the vital bridge, a practical and revolutionary step that proved the value of plate defense while paving the way for the larger, more elegant pieces that would follow. The Great Helm stands as a stark monument to this evolving battle between the weapon and the shield. Its transformation from a simple conical cap to a fully enclosed steel box was a direct response to the longbow's lethal reign. But enclosing a knight's head in a metal canister created a terrifying new problem. A solid, flat plate of steel, when struck by a mace, transfers the full force of the blow directly to the skull inside, with no give, no absorption. The solution was not just in the shape, but in the very way the helmet was built. The Great Helm was rarely a single piece of metal. It was an engineered assembly, often made from 4 or 5 separate plates, each one carefully shaped and then riveted together along reinforced edges. This assembly method was a metallurgical necessity. Creating one huge, complex curve from a single sheet of the best available steel was incredibly difficult and risked creating weak points or cracks during the quenching process. But creating several smaller, simpler curves was far more manageable. An armorer could focus on perfecting the heat treatment for each individual plate, ensuring it had the right balance of hardness and toughness before it ever became part of the whole structure. This modular approach was a brilliant workaround, allowing armorers to build a large, complex form from smaller, more reliably hardened components. Yet, for all its innovative construction, the Great Helm's flat surfaces remained a fatal flaw. They were perfect targets for crushing weapons, acting like anvils that focused a blow's energy rather than deflecting it. This critical weakness would ultimately force armorers to abandon the boxy design, but not before it had taught them an invaluable lesson. They had proven they could build large, assembled forms from quality steel, pushing their craft toward the next great leap, the move toward shapes that did not just stop a weapon, but made it slip harmlessly away. The Great Helm's rigid walls were a dead end, but the quest for head protection was far from over. The solution emerged not as a box, but as a skull, the elegant, close-fitting bassinet. This helmet was a masterpiece of form, but its true revolution lay in a single, pivoting component, the visor. Here, an armorer faced his most demanding test yet. He was no longer crafting a single, static shell. He was engineering a system with moving parts, each with its own contradictory survival needs. The rounded skull of the helmet needed to be a master of deflection, shaped to make blows glance away. But the visor was different. It was a target, a flat or rounded surface projecting right in front of the knight's face, designed to take direct, repeated impacts from lances and arrows. It had to be phenomenally hard to resist penetration, a property achieved through a severe water quench. Yet that same hardness made the metal brittle, a disaster waiting to happen at its thin, delicate pivot points. A single heavy blow could snap the lugs right off, leaving the knight blinded or worse. So the armorer had to perform a delicate balancing act, often on the very same helmet. He might quench the visor in water for maximum hardness, but then temper the skull of the helmet in oil, or even at a higher temperature, to give it the toughness to absorb broader impacts without cracking. Sometimes he would start with 2 different grades of steel altogether, using a simpler, tougher iron for the skull and reserving his best, most carefully carburized steel for the critical visor. This was applied science of the highest order. It meant managing multiple complex recipes for heat treatment simultaneously, understanding that a single piece of equipment was not one problem, but a collection of interconnected ones. The bassinet was a testament to an armorer's growing ability to not just make metal hard, but to precisely engineer its properties, giving each component exactly what it needed to survive on the battlefield. While European smiths were mastering the secrets of quenching and tempering, a completely different kind of steel was being forged far to the east, a metal so legendary it seemed to possess a soul of its own. This was wootz steel from India, also known in the West as Damascus steel. Its most famous feature was the mesmerizing, watery pattern that flowed across its surface like a frozen stream. But that beautiful design was merely the outward sign of an internal miracle of metallurgy. The secret to wootz was not in the hammer, but in the crucible. Iron was sealed inside a clay pot with precise amounts of carbon-rich material and heated for days. This long, slow, controlled process allowed the steel to cool over an incredibly extended period. This wasn't a violent quench, it was a patient, almost meditative crystallization. The result was a unique internal architecture, a microscopic landscape of ultra-hard carbide bands woven through a softer steel matrix. Modern science has even found carbon nanotubes in these ancient blades, structures that gave the steel a combination of properties that seemed impossible. A sword made from wootz could be razor-sharp, yet it was also incredibly tough and resilient, able to bend and spring back without breaking. It was, in many ways, the ultimate expression of what steel could be. While full suits of plate armor were not the tradition in these regions, the fame of these blades traveled thousands of miles. Along the bustling Silk Road, merchants and travelers carried stories and samples of this miraculous Eastern steel into the workshops of Europe. An armorer holding a Damascus steel sword would have been astounded. He could feel its superior edge, see its legendary pattern, and hear the tales of its near-mythical performance. This tangible proof that a better, more perfect steel was possible would have been a powerful inspiration. It is unlikely that European smiths could replicate the exact, secret recipe for wootz. But the knowledge that such a material existed, a steel that was both hard and flexible, may have pushed them to refine their own methods of carburization and tempering in pursuit of that same ideal. This forgotten influence reminds us that the knight's armor was not born in isolation. It was the product of a connected medieval world, where a secret forged in an Indian crucible could whisper new possibilities to a blacksmith in Milan or Cologne. Perhaps the ultimate expression of this miniature metallurgy was the articulated plate gauntlet. While a breastplate protected the torso, the gauntlet had to defend the most complex and vulnerable tools a knight possessed, his hands. Each finger was encased in a series of tiny, overlapping plates called lames, carefully riveted to allow the hand to curl into a fist or stretch open. The challenge here was not just about stopping a sword, it was about preserving the very dexterity needed to grip a rein, wield a weapon, or lift a visor. Every one of those miniature plates had to be a masterpiece in its own right. The steel had to be hammered incredibly thin for flexibility, yet thick enough to turn a blade. It had to be hard as glass on its outer surface to resist slicing, but remain supple and tough at the delicate joints to avoid cracking under stress. This balance was a nightmare to achieve in the forge. The heat treatment of such a small, thin piece was a terrifyingly precise operation. If the armorer heated it for even a few seconds too long during carburization, the carbon could penetrate too deep, making the entire lame brittle. The quench was even more perilous. Plunging one of these tiny components into water or oil was like trying to cool a needle in a bonfire. The thin metal could change temperature so rapidly it would warp, crack, or become unevenly hardened in an instant. A single failed quench on one finger lame could compromise the entire gauntlet. So why go through all this trouble for just a hand? Because a knight with a crippled hand was a knight who could no longer fight. The successful creation of a fully articulated gauntlet was the ultimate proof of an armorer's mastery. It demonstrated that the forgotten breakthroughs were not solely about forging massive, defiant breastplates, but were equally about the quiet, meticulous triumph of controlling metal on the smallest possible scale. But of all the components an armorer crafted, none represented a greater test of his skill than the cuirass. This single word describes the very heart of the knight's defense, the breastplate and backplate that shielded his torso. These were not assemblies of smaller plates. They were the largest, most demanding single pieces of steel in the entire harness. To create one was to embark on a physical and artistic marathon. The process began with that large, flat sheet of steel made possible by the trip hammers. The armorer would then heat it and begin the painstaking work of raising, hammering it over a rounded steel stake called a mandrel. With each precise, ringing blow, he was not just shaping the metal, he was physically changing its internal structure. This relentless hammering compressed the steel's crystalline grains, a phenomenon known as work hardening. It was like forging the metal twice, shaping it and strengthening it simultaneously through sheer mechanical force. The ultimate goal was a perfect, smooth curve, a shape designed to be an active partner in defense. A well-made breastplate did not just block a lance strike, it commanded the point to slide sideways, to glance off harmlessly toward the ground. But this deflective geometry was useless if the metal itself was flawed. Any inconsistency was a potential disaster. A thin spot hidden from view could be punched through by a determined thrust. A tiny slag inclusion, a remnant of imperfect refining, could act as a seed for a crack that would spiderweb across the entire plate under the force of a mace. This is why the successful creation of a flawless cuirass was the armorer's ultimate diploma. It proved he had mastered every single step of the journey. He had sourced or created a sheet of steel of impeccable quality. He had the artistic eye to shape it into a perfect, deflective form. He had the physical endurance to work harden it with thousands of perfect hammer blows. And he had the profound metallurgical understanding to heat-treat this massive, complex curve without warping or cracking it. The cuirass was not just a piece of armor. It was a walking testament to centuries of forgotten breakthroughs, a declaration that metal could now be commanded to protect life itself. This geometric intelligence transformed the knight into a living, moving fortress. The iconic globose breastplate, that proud, rounded chest, was far more than a symbol of status. It was a masterclass in physics. When a cavalry lance struck its center, the weapon did not bite in. Instead, the steep, convex curve forced the deadly point to slide upwards or sideways, a process armorers called glancing off. This redirection of force was the armor's secret weapon. By making a blow glance away, the breastplate drastically reduced the energy transferred to the knight's body. The steel itself did not have to withstand a full, concussive stop. It only had to survive a much weaker, sliding contact. This principle allowed armorers to use thinner, more manageable sheets of steel without sacrificing protection, creating suits that were far more mobile than their bulky appearance suggests. But the genius of deflection did not stop with simple curves. Look closely at a suit of German Gothic armor from the late 15th century, and you will see its surface is not smooth. It is covered in delicate, raised ridges, a technique known as fluting. Each one of these flutes acts like a structural rib, adding immense stiffness to the plate without adding significant weight. Think of the corrugated cardboard in a shipping box, a material that is both incredibly light and remarkably strong because of its shaped surface. Fluting did the same for steel. It made the armor more resistant to denting, transforming a flat, vulnerable plane into a rigid, architected shell. This was the ultimate fusion of the forge and the drafting table. The metal provided the raw strength, but the geometry multiplied that strength, turning a passive shield into an active defense system. The ultimate goal was never just to stop the blade, but to absorb the brutal physics of the blow itself. This brings us to one of the most intriguing mysteries in the history of armor: a concept that seems to leap centuries ahead of its time. Some rare artworks and fragmentary texts hint at a secret hidden inside the steel, a system known as lattice or cushioned armor. The theory suggests that certain elite suits may have contained a layered core, a sandwich of materials between the outer plate and the inner lining. Picture not just a solid wall of steel, but a composite structure where the visible plate was only the first line of defense. Beneath it, a lattice of hardened leather strips, or perhaps even packs of woven cloth or horsehair, could have been carefully stitched into place. Some even speculate about early attempts with sprung steel elements, tiny metal arcs designed to compress on impact. The sole purpose of this hidden assembly was shock absorption. When a warhammer landed with its soul-crushing force, the outer plate might not break, but it would deform inward, transmitting that energy. The lattice beneath would act like a microscopic battlefield, compressing and flexing to turn that single, sharp shock into a broader, more manageable pressure spread across the entire torso. It was a primitive but brilliant attempt to manage kinetic energy, the same invisible force that modern body armor is engineered to disperse with advanced polymers and gel packs. While we have very few surviving examples to prove this theory conclusively, the mere idea of it reveals a profound and sophisticated understanding of the problem. These armorers knew that a knight could be mortally wounded from the inside, his organs battered by a blow that never pierced his shell. Their solution was to build a suspension system for the human body, an attempt to cushion the very physics of violence. This leap in thinking shows they were not just metal workers, they were early engineers grappling with the same fundamental challenge that protects soldiers today: how to survive the impact that you cannot see. This secret knowledge was far too valuable to be written down. The true library of medieval metallurgy existed not on parchment, but in the hands and minds of the master armorers, protected by a powerful and secretive institution, the Craft Guild. To become an armorer was not a simple career choice. It was a years-long initiation into a closed society. A young boy, often just 12 or 13, would enter a workshop as an apprentice, signing a contract that bound him to his master for 7 years or more. His first duties were menial, sweeping the forge floor and minding the bellows. He learned by watching, by doing, and most of all, by silence. The deepest secrets, the mysteries of the craft, were revealed only slowly, and only after he had proven his trustworthiness. What was the perfect proportion of charcoal to bone meal for a cast hardening fire? What was the exact shade of blue that signaled the ideal temper for a visor? These were not public facts. They were the guild's most closely guarded assets, the proprietary formulas that gave a workshop in Milan or Augsburg its legendary reputation. This system created intensely specialized centers of excellence. If you wanted the best, most resilient steel for a breastplate, you went to Milan. If you desired the most elegant, fluted Gothic armor, you commissioned it from Augsburg. Each city's guild cultivated its own distinctive style and its own secret techniques, passed like a sacred torch from one generation of masters to the next. This secrecy might seem like it would stifle progress, but the opposite was true. Guilds competed ferociously for the patronage of kings and dukes. The constant pressure to produce a better, lighter, stronger suit of armor than their rivals in the next city overfueled a relentless, hidden engine of innovation. A master knew that if his workshop could perfect a slightly more reliable quenching oil, or devise a new hammering pattern that added strength without weight, his city's reputation and his own wealth would soar. This was not innovation for its own sake. It was a deadly serious commercial and military race. The guild system, for all its exclusivity, was the crucible that refined centuries of metallurgical breakthroughs, ensuring that the knight's armor did not just appear, but was meticulously evolved through generations of protected, competitive genius. Two distinct philosophies of defense were being forged in the workshops of Europe. In northern Italy, the armorers of Milan pursued a vision of seamless, organic protection. Their armor was a second skin of steel, celebrated for its smooth, rounded forms that seemed to flow over the body without a single harsh angle. This aesthetic was not merely for show, it was the direct result of a deep, specialized mastery over heat. The Milanese school perfected the process of case hardening, creating a shell of extraordinary hardness. They then polished this hardened steel to a mirror finish, a brilliant, gleaming surface that was as psychologically intimidating as it was physically functional, designed to dazzle an opponent and deflect the sun's glare. Their goal was to create an impenetrable carapace, a single, unified defense where every curve worked in harmony to turn a deadly point. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles to the north in the German city of Augsburg, a completely different approach was taking shape. Here, the armor was architectural. Augsburg masters embraced more angular lines and most famously covered their plates in intricate fluting. These sharp ridges and channels were a structural revolution, acting like the corrugated steel in a modern building to add immense rigidity without the burden of extra weight. Where the Milanese sought a unified whole, the German school excelled in brilliant articulation, engineering the joints with complex systems of overlapping lames to grant the knight unparalleled freedom of movement. These were not just different artistic tastes, they were competing answers to the same fundamental question: what is the best way to protect a human being in battle? The Milanese believed in a hard, deflective shell. The Germans believed in a mobile, resilient exoskeleton. This divergence almost certainly sprang from the very earth beneath their forges. The local iron ores in Italy and Germany had different impurity profiles, forcing smiths to develop unique smelting and refining techniques to produce workable steel. Over generations, the secret guild knowledge in each city compounded these differences, creating self-reinforcing traditions of excellence. A knight's choice between a Milanese and an Augsburg harness was therefore a choice between two entire philosophies of metallurgy, each a pinnacle of its own forgotten science. So how could a knight trust his life to a new suit of armor? The answer was a violent and very public demonstration. Before a harness was accepted, it faced its ultimate trial by crossbow. This was not a test of swords or maces, but a deliberate, scientific attempt to pierce the very heart of the defense. An armorer would take a finished piece, almost always a sample from the breastplate, and secure it to a sturdy post. Then, from a precisely measured distance, he would load and fire a heavy crossbow bolt directly at it. There was no room for ambiguity in this brutal ritual. If the bolt punched through the steel, the armor had failed, but if the plate held, showing only a deep dent or a gouge where the point had skidded or shattered, the armor was officially proven. It was now considered proofed. This single word, proof, carried the weight of a life-saving guarantee. To immortalize this success, the armorer would often engrave a special stamp right beside the point of impact. This was the proof mark, a permanent badge of honor etched into the steel. For a knight, that small symbol was everything. It was a certified promise that the metal had been hardened correctly, that the temper was true, and that the craftsman stood unequivocally behind his work. This practice represents one of the earliest and most honest forms of quality control in history. It created a powerful, closed loop of innovation. When a bolt did manage to pierce a plate, it was not just a failure, it was critical data. The armorer would examine the breach, learning exactly why his process had faltered. Was the steel too thin in that spot? Had the quench been uneven, leaving a soft zone? This direct, empirical feedback forced constant refinement. A proof mark was not just a stamp of quality, it was the final, silent word in a centuries-long conversation between the weapon and the shield, a conversation that forged both steel and trust in the fire of real-world testing. That proof mark was a guarantee of survival, but it came with a price tag as formidable as the armor itself. The finest plate harness was not just military equipment, it was a statement of almost unimaginable wealth, a luxury item reserved for kings, dukes, and the highest tier of nobility. The cost was staggering. A single, custom-fitted suit from a master in Milan or Augsburg could easily equal the price of a small estate, complete with its lands, manor house, and the peasants who worked the fields. This astronomical expense was not arbitrary. It was the direct cost of everything we have explored, the physical manifestation of those forgotten breakthroughs. You were paying for the highest quality crucible steel, for the weeks of a master armorer's undivided attention, for the secret guild knowledge of heat treatment, and for the sheer, brutal labor of the trip hammers. The price reflected the immense risk, where a single error during the quench could turn weeks of work into worthless scrap. For the nobleman, this was an investment in his own legend, a walking fortress that proclaimed his status on and off the battlefield. But how could entire armies be equipped if every soldier required the budget of a minor lord? The answer lay in a process of technological diffusion driven by pure economic necessity. As the most advanced techniques became more established within the great guild centers, a new tier of armor emerged, munitions grade. This was not bespoke art, it was standardized production. Workshops began producing functional, reliable armor in bulk, often in common sizes rather than custom fits. The intricate fluting and mirror polishing of a knight's harness were replaced by simple, smooth surfaces. The perfection of every single lame in a gauntlet gave way to good enough protection for a professional soldier's arm. This shift was not a downgrade in quality, but a triumph of efficiency. The economic pressure to equip larger, more professional armies forced the standardization and simplification of the most effective metallurgical processes. The secret knowledge of how to case hardened steel reliably, or how to achieve a consistent oil quench, was now applied to produce hundreds of nearly identical breastplates and helmets instead of one masterpiece. This trickle-down of technology meant that the life-saving benefits of those centuries of innovation, the resilient steel born from the Catalan Forge and perfected through tempering, eventually reached the common soldier. The knight's armor may have started as a singular work of art, but the economics of war ultimately transformed its underlying science into a shield for the many. Yet for all its genius, the reign of full-plate armor was shockingly brief. Its golden age lasted only about 130 years, a fleeting moment in the long history of warfare. The very innovations that birthed the knight's harness ultimately conspired to make it obsolete. The primary assassin was gunpowder. The arquebus, an early firearm, did not just hit harder than a longbow. It delivered a fundamentally different kind of impact. A steel bullet fired at point-blank range carried a concussive force so immense that no practical thickness of contemporary steel could absorb it. The physics were simple and brutal. The energy of a bullet was too great, too focused, and transferred too quickly. Even if the plate did not shatter, the blunt force trauma transmitted through the steel could be lethal, breaking ribs and pulverizing organs without leaving a single hole. Suddenly, the armorer's centuries of accumulated knowledge, his perfect quenches and his masterful tempers, were being defeated by a lead ball and a puff of smoke. Why carry the immense weight and cost of a full harness if it could not guarantee your survival against a common foot soldier with a gun? This technological shift coincided with a revolution in military tactics. Warfare was becoming less about the heroic charge of individual knights and more about the disciplined movement of vast professional infantry formations. In this new world, the highly specialized, incredibly expensive, and logistically cumbersome knight was a dinosaur. His armor, a masterpiece of metallurgy, had simply become too heavy, too slow, and too vulnerable for the battlefields of the future. The material itself, for all the forgotten breakthroughs that shaped it, had finally reached its absolute limit. The knight's armor may have faded from the battlefield, but its metallurgical soul did not. The profound understanding of steel forged over centuries in those smoky workshops became an invisible inheritance, a technological seed that would sprout into the Industrial Revolution. The same principles that gave a breastplate its life-saving balance of hardness and toughness were now applied to an entirely new world of machines. Consider the steam boiler, the heart of the new age. It was, in essence, a massive, pressurized cuirass. It required large, flawlessly welded sheets of steel that could withstand immense and constant stress, just like the plates of armor designed to stop a lance. The knowledge of how to produce such sheets reliably, how to heat-treat them to prevent brittle failure, and how to test them for hidden weaknesses all flowed directly from the armorer's craft. The water-powered trip hammers that once pounded steel into the curves of a helmet were the direct mechanical ancestors of the colossal forging presses that would shape crankshafts for steam engines and rails for railroads. This was not a coincidence, it was a direct technological lineage. The guild masters of Milan and Augsburg, in their relentless pursuit of the perfect harness, had unwittingly written the first chapter of the industrial age. They pioneered the quality control of ferrous metals, they mastered the large-scale production of steel components, and they developed the rigorous, hands-on science of material properties. So when we look at the iron skeleton of a 19th-century bridge or the mighty piston of a steam locomotive, we are not just looking at engineering. We are seeing the final, magnificent echo of the knight's shield, a testament to how the forgotten breakthroughs of the medieval forge helped to build the modern world. We can still hear the echoes of the medieval forge in the materials that protect us today. The same principles those armorers discovered through fire and intuition are now the bedrock of modern materials science. Take the concept of the composite, born from pattern welding's twisted strands of hard and soft metal. That ancient idea of combining materials to create a new substance with superior properties is the very soul of modern laminates. A sheet of bullet-resistant polycarbonate in a security vehicle is a composite. The layers of ceramic and woven fiber in a soldier's body armor plate are composites. Most famously, Kevlar, that miracle fabric used in soft body armor, is a composite on a microscopic scale. Its incredibly strong synthetic fibers are woven together and suspended in a resin matrix, creating a flexible sheet that is far stronger than the sum of its parts, just like the metal ropes forged 1,000 years earlier. The armorer's quest for the perfect balance between hardness and toughness is now a precise calculation in a metallurgical lab. When engineers design a car's suspension spring, it must be incredibly tough to absorb millions of cycles of stress without cracking, yet hard enough to resist deforming. They achieve this through meticulously controlled tempering processes, using digital ovens to reheat the steel to an exact temperature, replicating the color judgment of the ancient smith with scientific precision. Even the geometry of deflection lives on. The angled surfaces of a modern armored personnel carrier are not there by accident. They are designed to make incoming projectiles ricochet, exactly as a globose breastplate deflected a lance. A soldier's combat helmet has a rounded, smooth shape for the same fundamental reason as the bassinet, to make blows glance away. The medieval workshop, for all its soot and secrecy, was a functional laboratory. It was there, through generations of trial, error, and guarded tradition, that humanity first began to systematically explore and apply the fundamental laws of how materials behave under stress. We simply gave their discoveries new names and built upon the foundation they laid with fire and hammer. The evolution of knightly armor was far more than a simple change in fashion. It was a tangible record of a centuries-long clandestine revolution in metallurgy. That iconic suit of plate was the physical result of countless small victories, each one a hard-won secret passed from master to apprentice in the glow of the forge. From the artful deception of pattern-welded steel to the precise thermal cycles of quenching and tempering, every forgotten breakthrough was a triumph over the stubborn nature of metal itself. These were not discoveries made in royal courts or universities, but in the workshops of anonymous craftsmen who pushed their materials to the absolute limit. Their collective genius transformed the medieval warrior from a soldier in chainmail into a mobile fortress, and in doing so, they fundamentally reshaped the battlefields of Europe. This hidden history forces us to reconsider the so-called Dark Ages. They were clearly not a period of technological stagnation, but an era illuminated by the sophisticated fires of material science. The knight's armor, therefore, stands not just as a romantic symbol of chivalry, but as a powerful monument to human ingenuity. It is a testament to our enduring, ancient quest to build a better shield against an uncertain world. We would love to hear which of these forgotten breakthroughs you find most fascinating. Was it the color-coded science of tempering, the industrial power of the trip hammer, or the secret shock absorption of cushioned armor? Share your thoughts in the comments below and subscribe for more journeys into the hidden science of history.